Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Scott McCandless.
And I'm Cindy Bloom.
Concerns about geopolitical risks to the U.S. economy have grown in recent years and continue to challenge companies around supply chain and global investment issues.
And joining us to talk about the outlook for risk assessment for companies is Craig Stronberg. Craig, welcome.
Glad to be here.
All right, let's get started and talk about the risk outlook. But first, the amount of risk that companies are facing has increasingly gone up. Talk about how much risk companies are facing today and what they're facing.
So it has gone up. And if you look at what they've told us, right, in the CEO survey, what they tell us when they talk to us every day, media outlets, one another, there's a clear signal this is going up. Now, to be clear, there is a general agreement that macroeconomic risk may be going down slightly, or at least becoming more understanding. But geopolitical risk is rising dramatically. And I think part of the problem is that the geopolitical system was weak going into COVID. But it was understandable enough that companies could get their arms around it. COVID was a meteor strike, right? It threw a lot of things into chaos. Most of those things are still not balanced. And every sort of local or global crisis that comes along, and we've seen a lot of those recently, makes this much more harder for companies to do the anticipating that is required to run a global business. So they feel that it is harder, and in fact, it is harder to understand all of this.
Craig, you've used the word disequilibrium to describe the state of the world. Does that term still apply, or are there other ways you're characterizing it?
So this is a really good question. And I think it does apply. But I think the challenge, and I think this relates to the first question, right, is that disequilibrium, when we started talking about this, was something that we thought might eventually go back. Because if you talk about disequilibrium, the assumption is at some point you get back to equilibrium. And maybe that's happening with the economy. Maybe, but not with geopolitics. And so what's happening is that disequilibrium is becoming the current state of affairs. It is becoming the status quo. And so you move past it and you enter what economists and even people at the Pentagon call VUCA, right? Which is an acronym of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which pretty much describes the operating environment geopolitically we're in. And this is sort of how we're urging companies to think about this, because you need a strategy not just for disequilibrium, but for volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity. And how do you tackle these things? How do they change your policy? How do they change your operations? And how do you think about them far into the future? So unfortunately, it means they're probably here to stay. Nothing's forever, but this geopolitical uncertainty, this VUCA, is going to be with companies for a while.
Okay. And let's get into some detail about the global forces affecting companies as well as conducting business. And there are numerous global forces, not to mention this year is big with elections, Taiwan, India, Mexico, and of course the United States. Talk about the impact these global forces have on companies and what companies are doing or could be doing to address them.
So I think when it comes to these forces, when it comes to the ones that businesses should really be paying attention to, I think there's a couple that really need to be top of mind. So one of them is polarization, which we could probably talk about, separately. But the other is this injection of national security that the US has brought to a lot of its policymaking, right? For most of US policymaking history, the US government's job, regardless of who's in charge, is to make the world safe for companies to grow, because if companies grow, US GDP grows and everybody's happy. Since you've had Ukraine and since you've had the growth of China, the US government is increasingly becoming more protectionist, exporting that protectionist policy globally, asking foreign companies to do things that they aren't usually doing, and making national security much more of an interface between it and the business world, and asking businesses to do things that businesses are not always comfortable with. Sure. This is new, and this is where a lot of the business world meets VUCA on a daily basis.
Craig, finally, you had mentioned polarization. Can you talk a little more about that, and specifically how companies might think about it or even try to address it?
So it's interesting. When we started looking at polarization a couple of years ago, we did so because we felt it was important. But we weren't sure that companies would ever really ask us about it. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that if in the last 4 or 5 months, we're getting a lot of questions about this from companies who are trying to understand how polarization in the electorate might impact activity amongst the consumers, right? Traditionally, there's been a firewall there where someone's behavior politically might not affect how they purchase things, right? You might purchase things just because of price point or loyalty or tradition or ease, whatever it is. And for many consumers, that's still true. But what businesses are fearful of, and what they're seeing some examples of, is that consumers are changing the way they might behave ever more likely because of polarization. And the other thing that's happening is, as businesses, you used to be able to approach the United States, the American market, in a single strategy sort of way. You could have a strategy for environmental policy, social policy, governance, whatever it is, and have a single policy that you might adapt a couple of places. Now, because of the real distinct polarization at the local level, many businesses need to operate differently. And what they need to do is have a hyper-localized understanding of how those people, those consumers, those stakeholders in that market might be thinking about their products, their services, their brand. And for a lot of companies, that knowledge is expensive and it's beyond what they can afford. But they are beginning to struggle with a one-size-fits-all because polarization is making their job incredibly difficult.
Interesting. Greg, thank you as always so much for your insights. Appreciate you being with us.
Thank you for having me.